Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Q-Who, which is episode 16 of season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a Patreon requested video requested by patron Allison Fordyce. So, Q-Who is the episode in which Q comes to Picard wanting to join the crew as a team member, and when Picard turns him down, Q warns that he'll need him in order because he has no idea what's out there waiting for him, and then flings him across the galaxy where they come across the Borg, an unstoppable cybernetic species that then proceed to destroy or try to destroy the Enterprise and taunt them, and the Enterprise seems to have no way out, so Picard has to beg for Q to save them, and Q does. Now, this episode was requested by Allison Fordyce, who watched one of my reviews for Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, when I talked about in that review how the first two seasons of The Next Generation were terrible, and they were not doing good. And she thought, well, there's a few exceptions to this, like Q-Who, so asked if I review it. Now, I did warn her, however, that I did not think of as highly as this episode as many others do, because a lot of people hold this in high esteem. It will make a many of top 10 and top 20 best episodes, and many consider it one of the best, if not the best, of the first two seasons. I do not, but she said she wanted me to go ahead and review it anyway, so that's what I'm going to do. Now, because it's funny, because I did, if you're not familiar with my channel, a couple years ago I did a video with Atkin Tomko, my brother, and Phil the Issues guy, where we took the top 5 highest rated episodes from each of the 5 Star Trek series, original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, to form a top 25, so the top 5 from each of those, and we each took turns, like, rating it from our lowest to highest. And I went first, and I named this episode Q-Who, which was in the IMDb top 5 for Next Generation. I named it's like the IMDb, that's where we did it. It's like they rate the episodes and they have the average rating. And I rated this as my lowest. This is my number 25. I went first, and I was like, this is 25. This episode doesn't belong here. Which, you know, the other two people involved greatly disagreed with me and thought there were many episodes that were worse than that, but that was my opinion. That I don't believe that any first or second season Next Generation episode belongs anywhere near a top 5. And I was appalled that there were 2 in the IMDb's top 5, Q-Who and Measure of the Man. Now, the Measure of the Man is my favorite episode from the first 2 seasons, but even that wouldn't make a top 20 for me. Maybe a top 30, but that's it. And Q-Who, I think it was just like average. I don't think that belongs anywhere near a conversation of a top 20, let alone a top 5. But that's, again, just my opinion. And watching this episode again, I can see how it's very season 2-ified. It's very a part of season 2, which was not good. There was a lot of stuff that makes season 2 bad. It makes this episode bad too, and it was very noticeable in it. So I personally wouldn't put it anywhere near a conversation of the best Next Generation episodes, or like any episode from the first 2 seasons, because the first 2 seasons, I still, in my opinion, are that bad. And The Measure of the Man is the only episode that could be anywhere near that conversation, but even that I personally wouldn't put in the top 20. Now, I did already do a review of Measure of the Man, but anyway, I know a lot of people were telling me that I'm probably looking at this episode from the lens of someone who's been oversaturated with the Borg and not sort of in the mindset of seeing the Borg for the first time, because this was the first appearance of the Borg, which is probably true to an extent. But when I first saw this episode, I said I liked it and I watched it a lot, but I was doing something which I referred to a lot as phantom menacing. That is, when you watch something for the first time, you're told it's awesome, everyone thinks it's awesome, you expect it to be awesome, so you watch it and you convince yourself that it's awesome, And then later on you realize, well, maybe it's not as good as I thought, because I always had this sinking feeling, even though I was like trying to convince myself that this was an awesome episode, the sinking feeling that something wasn't working. And when I got a bit older and I came to terms and like looked at it objectively, I could see that it actually isn't as good as I was trying to convince myself it was. And I never liked this episode as much as any other people did. So it's not just an oversaturation or looking at it in hindsight. I never actually put this episode on as high as a pedestal as everyone else did. Now, that being said, I'm sure there is an effect, because I watch this now and I can't help but think of how different the Borg in this episode barely resemble the Borg that we know and love from future appearances, not just in Voyager but also Next Generation. Now, they're completely like the Voyager Borg and this Borg here are totally different. There's no resemblance whatsoever, but that's yeah. So anyway, the reason why I don't really think this episode worked very well, and I think I should throw this out there, is mainly not the Borg element, but the Q element. Now, with the Borg, I thought, watching this episode again, I did, when I hear people saying, well, you're just in the mindset of oversaturated in hindsight and later stuff, so I thought, okay. When I watched this episode last night, I tried to come at it in the mindset that I didn't know who the Borg was, and trying to put myself in the mindset of someone who had no idea who the Borg was and seeing them for the first time. Now, this actually was the first episode I ever saw with the Borg, even though I did see it like a couple years after it was released. I did see this episode before Best of Both Worlds and before iBorg, although I saw iBorg before Best of Both Worlds, which was a bit funny, out of order, but whatever. But this, and I actually had heard of the Borg before I watched this episode. I've read stuff about them. There was like a book about them I read parts of, so I already knew who the Borg were. But this was the first episode that I saw with the Borg, and yeah, they did come off as scary. And watching this again, I could see they did get the ominous tone really well, and they did because they did set out to make the Borg this unstoppable, really scary, horrific villain. And I think this episode actually does a better job at this than some of the later stuff, particularly the Voyager stuff. And because Voyager just made them goofy, but I talked about that in my Voyager review. Even like Descent, which wasn't very good, two-parter. I think so. This episode actually did do a really great job of making them ominous. When they send the individual Borg drones over and they try to shoot them, and they just sit there and stare at them and be like, and then when they try to run away from the Borg ship and they keep throwing torpedoes at it, but it just regenerates and just keep coming. It seems like there's absolutely no way to stop them. That was adequately scary, and the whole point of the episode was Q was trying to prove to them that that there is really scary shit out there that they haven't encountered before, and they don't really know what they're getting into. And I think this episode did do a good job with that. So what's my problem with this episode? Well, my problem again is the Q element. It felt very forced, very contrived way to introduce the Borg. It's, my brother Apkin Tomku has this channel, and he did a review of each season of Next Generation, and for his review of like the first episode, he talked about I'm sorry for Apkin if I'm quoting you here, but in his review he talked about the first episode and saying how it was basically showing off their new trinkets. Oh, look, we have a British captain. Oh, look, the ship can separate. Oh, look, and he the way he said it was like, oh, isn't this cool? Oh, we have this ship that can separate. Isn't that cool? And in season 2, he said the same thing with they're introducing Guinan and Ten Forward and Dr. Pulaski and Riker with the beard, and again he was like, isn't that cool? cool. Well, I'd actually say the same thing with this episode, Q Who. This is how it came off to me. It came off, ooh, look, here's this great unstoppable villain. Aren't they cool? And the reason why I say that is because it does seem very obvious to me that this is a hand-fisted way to say, oh, here's an awesome new villain. And rather than it feeling natural or like a good constructed story. And that's the ultimate problem I have with this episode, is that I don't think the story was constructed very well. I think it felt very jarring. Q just shows up. I think the whole Q element just doesn't work. I think the writers were very at a loss to find a natural, a good way to introduce the Borg. And so they're like, oh, let's just have Q pop up and say, fling him across the galaxy and throw him up against the Borg. And why would he do this? Well, he wants to join the crew, and Picard won't let him, so he gets pissed off. There we go. See, it felt very rushed. And I have no doubt that it was, because this is a result of the writer's strike. A lot of the reason why season 2 was not good, and we get a lot of bad episodes in season 2, was because of the writer's strike, and they didn't have as much time to think things out, because apparently, like, the Borg was an idea that Maurice Hurley, who was the head writer for Next Generation for season 1 and 2, the bad seasons, is an idea that he had ever since season 1, and it was something that he worked with Gene Roddenberry to construct and create. So it's an idea they had not since the very beginning, because the very beginning was the Ferengi, but they failed. So they're like, oh, they thought up of, well, let's do this unstoppable villain. Now, first the idea was to have them be insects, like insectoid type, but then they found that they didn't have the budget for that to make it look cheesy. So then they changed it to be a cybernetic species, which I actually think, so in both cases they kept the sort of hive mind aspect of it. And then of course later on they'd introduce the queen, which is also very insect-like, but that's not until years from now. But and I think that sucks, but I'll get to that actually tomorrow when I do my first Contact review. But anyway, yeah, that was their idea, is to have this unstoppable villain, but they tried to introduce them at the end of season 1, and you could see in the season 1 finale, the neutral zone, they actually make reference to the outposts along the Romulan border, and both the Federation and Romulan side being destroyed and being scooped up. And they even have a line in this episode that they find some planets where the colonies were just scooped up, just like they saw. So, and that's the only connection that they made. Otherwise, like, if you look at it linearly, those episodes make no sense. It makes no sense that the Borg would be all the way to the Federation Romulan side and just disappear and do nothing else. That's totally not in keeping with them. So it's obviously inconsistent with the writing. It had a lot to do with the writing strike, because originally the plan was to do a 3-parter where the neutral zone would be the first part, and then the first 2 episodes of season 2 would explore the Borg, and it would create this huge 2-parter thing, which is, I guess, their idea is to do something which would eventually become Best of Both Worlds. But again, because of the writer's strike, that never came to fruition. But Maurice Hurley kept pushing forward this Borg idea because he really liked it, and eventually he got some traction, and they let him do this episode, Q Who. And I think, and from the way I just described it, sounds like they kind of just rushed and, okay, you can do this, and they half-assed it. And I think that's exactly how this episode comes off to me. It comes off as half-assed. I think if they would have if it wasn't for the writer's strike, maybe they would have done the story properly, and the introduction to the Borg would have made a lot more sense. They could have fed it into the storyline about the neutral zone being attacked, and it would have felt a lot more sort of natural the way it's done here. It just seems like very sudden, very jarring, and I never bought the fact that Q was the one who just, let's fling you in front of the Borg. Because I know they'll retcon this later with like Voyager and Enterprise and the First Contact and all this, but for the moment, when this episode was written, and even Best of Both Worlds, pretty like all of TNG, I'm talking about, like post TNG, they retconned a lot of shit, which I don't buy, and I got to that and all the other stuff. But for TNG, the concept is that the Borg only came to the Federation because Q flung the ship in front of the Borg. And so the Borg were following the Enterprise, and Q flung them back to the Federation. But the idea, and this is stated in Best of Both Worlds, is that the Borg ship kept coming. Like, it never stopped chasing the Enterprise. It chased them straight back into the Federation, but it just took them a really long time to get there. It took them a couple of years, which is in keeping with what they said in this episode, because when Q flung the Enterprise to, in front of the Borg, Data said it would take us 2 years to get home. So that's kind of in keeping with that, so the Borg just didn't stop. And I mean, even though I don't like the retconning, I also don't like the fact that Q was the one who basically everything would have, all the people died with the Borg, Wolf 359, 18 people. It's all Q's fault because he wanted to get them ready. Now, I heard some arguments that he was just like, he was trying to show them a way. He was trying to get them prepared that they were going to encounter the Borg regardless. And if you pay attention to that retconning bullshit post TNG, then it's definitely the case where the Borg were going to come to Earth or the Federation regardless, and Q was doing them a favor by getting them prepared. But I don't really buy that. And plus, like, Q's whole thing is, I want to join the crew. Why would he? I just really don't buy that. It doesn't really make any sense. And then when Picard does say, let me, please help me, you're right, Q. Q doesn't join the crew. I thought that was his whole point. He's just like, all of a sudden, he just doesn't care about joining the crew anymore. So that whole motivation thing about why Q would fling them over and why he would want to join, that felt very weak to me. And that's the main reason why I don't hold this episode in such high esteem. Like, a lot of people, when they talk about this episode, they just talk about how ominous the Borg come off and how creepy it is, and I agree. I totally agree. That is a high point, but I think a lot of people overlook the low points, which is the whole Q thing, which I just did not buy. And also, on top of that is the Guinan thing. I mean, I think people even like this episode will point out that this was done very poorly. Because they're implying this episode that Q and Guinan, like, they know each other and they have this huge feud, and Q is like, don't trust this creature, and Guinan, like, does this thing where she's like almost like a cat when Q threatens her. She just goes like this. What the fuck does she think that will do? Does she think that will stop Q, has like omnipotent powers, from doing anything to her? And if the answer is that it actually would, then that's something that needed to be explored more. That makes Guinan hell of a lot more powerful than she's ever portrayed to be, ever. If she can actually defend herself against Q, that would make her hugely powerful. And why the fuck would she be tending bar on a freaking starship if she's that powerful? So that whole thing was dumb to me. And having the Q and her it just seemed like, to me, the writers were trying to make Guinan more relevant. And I think they tried a bit too hard in this episode. Now, the stuff with her species being wiped out by the Borg and that she knew them, I mean, that was okay, but it still seemed a bit out of a left field to me, and a bit like they're trying too hard to make her relevant. I just think the whole writing of this episode felt very rushed to me, and it wasn't structured very well. But yeah, the whole thing about the Borg wanting... Now, let me get into some of the differences in this episode, because the Borg were... And later we know the Borg, they say, you will be assimilated, resistance is futile. They did not say resistance is futile in this episode, and they were not shown, like, assimilation was totally not a thing in this episode. That's something that they wouldn't, like, they first introduced that in Best of Both Worlds when they assimilated Picard, but even then, I don't think their whole goal, they didn't say like their whole goal was to assimilate entire species. That's something that wasn't really brought up until like Iborg, until like the 5th season, that where they really integrated it as a normal thing. I think in the Best of Both Worlds is more of they stated it as they wanted Picard to be the voice who could communicate with the humans and be the bridge, and of course so they could learn everything he knew and so they could conquer Earth. But that didn't seem, they seemed like they were just singly using Picard. And then, First Contact and all this shit would twist and manipulate that to say, oh, he was supposed to be counterpart for the Borg Queen, which I think is total horseshit. But again, I'll get into that tomorrow. But anyway, so yeah, and assimilation wasn't a thing until much later. So this episode portrayed the Borg just as they were only interested in the technologies. Like the way Q states it is that they see the Enterprise as something that they can consume, and their whole point was just to go around to different worlds, steal all their technology and just kill everyone else. That's how they were described, like, because the whole thing, and this is something that Voyager and later stuff would not really follow up on, forget, and focus more on the assimilation aspect. But at this stage, it was the whole thing, even like Best of Both Worlds, is scooping up colonies, so there's a giant hole. So what it's assumed that they do is that they scoop up all the technology and just kill all the people who is there. And they even stated like several times that we are not interested in your tech, and you just want the technology. And the whole thing about with the Borg, and this became like a really stupid thing they did in Next Generation, Voyager and later stuff would retcon this, is that they can just beam aboard the Borg ship and be ignored, and the Borg just ignore intruders, which to me never makes any sense. Like, why? And actually they did keep this up a bit in Voyager, and it felt really out of place there. It doesn't make sense, especially from what they turned the Borg into, but it's just, I guess, because it was established in this episode and further in Best of Both Worlds that you can beam aboard a Borg ship and they'll just ignore you because they think you're insignificant, which I think they're smart enough to know better. I mean, I guess the idea in this episode is that you were insignificant, but later episodes it shows that they can do severe damage when they're aboard the Borg ship, so I never bought. Especially if their whole point was to assimilate people. If they beamed aboard, you think they would, here's some assimilation fodder, and just assimilate them. So, I mean, it didn't really jive later on. That's one thing they sort of kept that didn't work with all the changes that they made to the Borg. But for this episode, it kind of worked, but it was more of, again, just an excuse for them to show the inside of a Borg ship so they can show Riker go around and say, oh, these are where they're connected. No, here's the little baby Borg, which is totally different from, like, assimilation. Like, what they presented here is that they reproduce and they take children, they're born as fully human, but then integrate the cybernetic systems as an infant. So it's not, the whole assimilation thing was, again, much later, and this doesn't really jive with the whole maturation chamber thing, which is established later on. But anyway, I don't know, in some ways, like, I kind of like the Borg in this episode better than some of the stuff, particularly the Voyager stuff, because as I said, the Voyager stuff made them goofy. And I'm talking about after season 5. Like before, like season 4 Borg were good. Season 5 is when they introduced the Queen, and they all started going downhill after that. Introduced the Queen into Voyager. I know she was introduced in First Contact. Don't tell me that. I know that. But I meant like when Voyager introduced the Queen into. But anyway, regardless, I'm not talking about that anymore. Anyway, I want to talk about the Borg. I was just talking about the Borg, but the concept of the Borg. And I'm going to get into some political leanings and stuff here. So if that kind of talk is not your thing, or if you're like really right-wing leaning and you don't want to hear my leftist, communist rant or whatever you call it, then you might want to tune out now. But so it's been suggested, and it's generally like the general view about the Borg nowadays is that it's a analogy for socialism. That's basically because it's like a hive mind. It's a collective, so it's a collective thinking. It's an analogy for extreme socialism, where there's no individuality and you just have to do what the collective wants to do. And to be fair, that is definitely how Voyager and later incarnations of Star Trek, like Enterprise and First Contact and stuff, that's how they portray them. Because at this stage, that stage, I should say, later on, Roddenberry has long since passed away, and is the other writers such as Brendan Braga and Ronald D. Moore and Rick Berman, who I've mentioned before. Even though I love Ronald D. Moore, a lot of them have a 20th century mindset, and more specifically an American 20th century mindset. So in the American 20th century mindset, you would see the Borg as a analogy for socialism, because socialism is this bad thing that strips away all individuality. But I still maintain, and I got a lot of drawback from this, but I've heard some rumors but no concrete evidence, so this is mainly just my opinion. But to me, like, I'm 100% certain this is the case. When this idea was first thought of in season 1, the Borg, it was combined effort by Maurice Hurley and Gene Roddenberry. The Borg has conceived here was a anti-capitalist message, not an anti-socialist message. Now, a lot of people can't grasp that, because again, they think, looking from the American mindset of what socialism and communism is, they think, oh, collectivism, loss of individuality equals socialism. But in this episode, they don't really focus on they do present it as a hive mind, but they don't focus on the lack of individuality aspect of it, as Voyager and later stuff would do. What you also have to understand, the first 2 seasons of Next Generation, Gene Roddenberry was very much in control, and he was very much into this utopian, moneyless society vision that most people would refer to as left-leaning. I watched this video recently that did the political spectrum. If you look at it as a square, and you have left on one side, right on the other, and authoritarianism on top, and libertarianism on the bottom, where does Star Trek political aspect fit in that spectrum? And their conclusion was it was completely on the left, which I know this is mirroring me. It's left for me, just trust me. But anyway, it was completely on the left, but slightly towards the authoritarianism side. But I actually think I disagree with that video's conclusion, because I think they're looking at a lot of evidence from stuff that was outside of Roddenberry's, that was after his passing, where the other writers had taken on, and they portrayed Starfleet a bit more authoritarianism than Roddenberry had wanted, because Roddenberry was very much against the idea of Starfleet being a military, or there being authoritarian. So maybe that's, if you look at the whole entire Star Trek franchise as a whole, maybe that's where it would fit. But if you're looking at just Roddenberry's vision, particularly at this point in time, I would actually say, well, the completely to the left thing was correct, but I would actually put it slightly below towards the libertarian side rather than the authoritarian side. I think that was Roddenberry's vision. And yes, you can be left and a libertarian at the same time. A lot of people don't realize it, because it's more commonly known to be right-leaning libertarian, but there's also left-leaning libertarian as well, which I actually know about because I used to be involved a lot in this movement, but I don't want to get too much into that. But Star Trek, especially Roddenberry's vision, has always been a left-leaning libertarian type, because that's something that actually a lot of those people would hold up, would look to Star Trek as an example of this. So anyway, in the first season, they introduced the main villain that they first introduced to be the main villain for Next Generation were the Ferengi. Now, I talked about the Ferengi. They're very obviously anti-capitalist statement. Very obvious. Anyone could see that. The word Ferengi apparently was based off of, it sounds similar to an Afghan word meaning white person or other. I think it means foreigner, but they typically use that word to describe white people. Even in the episode when they first introduced the Ferengi themselves, the data makes mention to Yankee traders, so it's very obvious. Now, some people state it as not so much anti-capitalist, but anti Wall Street corruption, because the other thing is important to note is that this was made in the late 80s, where Wall Street corruption and corporate corruption like that was running wild. Not that it's not still running wild, but it was the beginning of that. It was on the forefront of people. So you have movies like Wall Street that illustrated stuff like this. It's just, and plus it was like the heydays of the 80s where they really were unchecked and can get away with anything. So it was a huge problem. So it's something that Roddenberry wanted to highlight against. But I do, and it's not just anti-capitalism might be the wrong word for it. It has more to do, because then if you think, oh, you're anti-capitalist, that means you're a communist. Gene Roddenberry was not at all communist. Star Trek, as it portrays, is not communism. As I said, it's sort of left-leaning socialism, which is libertarian socialism, I should say, sorry, which is a totally different thing. But again, I'm not going to get too much into that sort of thing. But it's totally different than what you would typically think of as communism, because that's usually associated with authoritarianism, which is something Gene Roddenberry was also very much against, which he made evident from his. But anyway, that's a very black and white way of looking at it. Anyway, there's so many different things on the political spectrum. But point is, he was against the whole, I should say, corrupt capitalism rather than the idea of having a free market. That's fine, but it's obvious in the 80s, and I would say even up to today, that especially as it's practiced widely in America, has become very twisted and corrupt, and it does a lot for the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which isn't necessarily how free markets are supposed to work. And in fact, I could get more into this, how the creative free market capitalism would be upheld, or not the creative, but I should say the early pioneers who originally imagined this would be appalled of what it turned into. And this isn't the correct idea of how free market capitalism isn't supposed to work. So when I say anti-capitalism, I don't mean against the whole principal idea of free market capitalism. I mean, has it the corrupt version that's being practiced in the 80s and up to today. And that's what Gene Roddenberry was very much against, and I agree with him. And as I say, the Ferengi was a very obvious statement against that. Very obvious, but has a species that kind of fucked it up, and I talked about this before, how they come off as like, it was a guy having sort of an anti-corrupt capitalist was a good idea, but there were way better ways to do that. So the Borg was kind of their second time. And again, this is all speculation. I don't know this for certain, but it seems to me that the Borg was their second attempt. All right, we fucked up with this anti-corrupt capitalism message with the Ferengi. Let's try it again with the Borg. So now you might be thinking, well, how's I still don't get why the Borg is a message against corrupt capitalism, where it seems, again, it's focused on like the hive mind, which seems more to do with socialism. Well, I've read stuff that, and especially has perceived in this episode, as I said, if you look at later Borg stuff, those writers who were doing that definitely were doing an anti-socialism message. But if you look at this episode in Best of Both Worlds and some of the earliest stuff, and again, this is when Gene Roddenberry and Maurice Hurley didn't necessarily share Roddenberry's views, but it was his boss, so he went along with it. So at this stage, they were very firmly into making anti-capitalist or anti-corrupt capitalism messages, and so I have no singular doubt in my mind that that was their image with the Borg. Now, why do I say this? Because, well, first of all, the Borg ship, and someone pointed this out once, looks kind of like an office building. And being sort of involved in some of this anti-capitalist, or I should say, libertarian socialism kind of movements, and talking to a lot of people and reading material on this sort of thing, we often would refer to people who work normal office jobs, 9 to 5, dress up in the businesses, go into business. We would refer to them as drones. To be perfectly frank. So, and we would always talk about how they all look alike, they all think alike, they have a sort of a collective mind, they all do the same thing, they live an original, they have no sort of creativity, they just live boring lifestyles, and they were drones. And I think that's along the lines of what they were thinking of with the Borg. Also, how they say the Borg have no leaders, so there's no one you can take down or whatever. This sort of a hive thinking, and you can look at corporations the same way. Now, there are CEOs and people in charge, but if a CEO does something that hurts the stockholders or hurts the overall bottom line of a corporation, they're out of there. So even though they're technically in charge, they're not like the leader per se. It's more of a thing. If you've ever studied the nature of corporations and stuff like that, it's more of an entity that is beyond any one person. So I definitely, and especially watching this episode, I think because the thing with authoritarian socialism, which is what the later Voyager stuff would make, and I think that's why they introduced the Borg Queen, because they need to have their dictator. But it was very clear, any specific dictators, in the extreme communism, socialism side. But as the Borg are portrayed here, there's no dictator, there's no Borg Queen. And that because they were going off of more that corporate analogy, where there is no specific leader, where it's just this thing. And as you also look at the way capitalist culture and corrupt capitalist culture affects third world countries, who are basically, they're only third world countries because of the effect of capitalism in other countries. And this is, again, I might get a lot of disagreements, that's why I gave the political warning, but this is something else that I studied, that many of these sort of are in a massive debt to the rich nations of the world. And basically the rich nations of the world, the big corporations and stuff, they come in and they basically strip the country of all their resources so they can be sold off to the richer countries. That's a very simplistic way of putting a complex issue, but I've already been talking for too long. So I have to sort of simplify it. But that's basically what happens. So I definitely think the whole thing with the Borg going in and scooping out whole colonies and taking all the resources is definitely an analogy for capitalism, what capitalism does to third world countries, or at least how those in the libertarian socialism movement perceive it to be. And that's, as I said, Roddenberry was very, very clearly in that category. And I talked about the episode The Neutral Zone, which was the finale for season 1. They had very overt anti-capitalism or anti-corrupt capitalism messages. Very overt. He was just right out spitting it out. And that's actually one of the reasons why I like that episode, to be honest. And so it's very clear to me that, and since we know that the Borg was conceived for that episode and around that same time, and to be a substitute for the Ferengi, who were very clearly anti-capitalist, that this is definitely the intention of the creators when they first started. They weren't thinking of socialism, they were thinking of capitalism, and how, people in business suits, they all dress alike, they all look alike, they all think alike. I know that's insulting and a simplistic way of saying it, but that's how some, with this viewpoint that Roddenberry has, could view it. And they evolved this unstoppable thing that sort of just ravages the planet and rips all the resources away from those who use it. Now, I'm not saying that's how capitalism is, although I kind of think it is, but I'm saying that is how Roddenberry views it to be. And it's definitely, I think, can definitely be seen in his portrayal of the Borg in this episode. But anyway, I think I talked about that enough. And Roddenberry wasn't as involved. He kind of stepped back in Best of Both Worlds, but I think for the most part they kind of kept that same sort of vibe. I think they started to veer off into the socialism thing a bit more in Borg and First Contact, and definitely Voyagers, where they went full on, like the whole storyline with 7 of 9 was definitely full on, I lost my individuality because of this socialist movement, and here's the Borg Queen dictator and whatnot. So they definitely switched it from capitalism to socialism, which is a bit ironic when you think about it. But I definitely think that the original intention was an anti-capitalist message. Anyway, I think I've ranted enough about that. Let me get to my rating for Q Who. Out of 10 is a 6 good. As I said, the Borg were scary. It was very ominous, very effective, even more so than later Borg episodes at being very ominous, very creepy. But the plot structure just fell apart, so I can't give this any more than a 6, and that's why I very strongly feel that this episode is very, very much overrated. Even though some things work, I do think it is a victim of the writer's strike, and it needed several more drafts, several more passes on the script to tighten it up, because as it stands, it comes off a bit weak, a bit contrived, and I just don't buy Q's involvement. Anyway, that is it for my review of Q Who. Thanks so much for Allison Fordyce for suggesting this. Sorry I went off on this little capitalism rant, but I just really wanted to get into that. Anyway, if you'd like to support my channel, you can, yes, I'm the evil capitalist now asking for money, but if you'd like to support the channel, yeah, you can follow the Patreon link below, and if you donate $10 or more, you can request a video, any video you want for me to do, and I'll do it, kind of like this one. So thanks again for Allison Fordyce and all the patrons for support for my channel. Anyway, if you're finding me for the first time, you can check out my channel as I do lots of other Star Trek videos. As I said, I'm doing a series at the moment for where I cover every Star Trek movie, and I also cover other shows like The Expanse, Game of Thrones, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.